beginning of this recording because things in the news cycle are moving so quickly that what we discuss today might be overtaken by events by the time this podcast comes out in several days, or by the time that our listeners or viewers are watching it on their own schedule. But we know at this point that the U.S. and China have not yet announced that they have formally entered any sort of talks to resolve the tariff dispute and trade disputes that have been brewing between the two countries for several years, but have become more acute after Donald Trump's announcement of not only baseline tariffs, but also reciprocal tariffs, particularly his policy move to keep tariffs on China while giving a pause to other countries for 90 days to negotiate deals. What do you think is going on right now? Like, how would you characterize U.S.-China relations in this moment?
Well, that's the question I think a lot of people are asking. And on the upside, I think China now is in the May holiday, which will last for 5 days. Mm-hmm. So for the immediate 5 next days, don't expect too much response from Beijing, I guess, because people are on vacation. And so maybe there is a little bit of pause on the Beijing side. But overall, as you just said, I think the U.S.-China relations are at a very tense period, precisely because of the tariffs, and especially since the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, when President Donald Trump, put tariffs on a lot of trading partners, and then withdrew some of them, so that leaves China like now at up to 245% on some Chinese exports to the United States. Of course, in the process, like China retaliated against the U.S. imposed tariffs. I think yesterday, which is April 30th, there were 2 interesting pieces out of 2 Chinese social media accounts. One was run by China state broadcaster, the China Central Television. The account is known as Yuyuan Tantian, and the other by Chairman Rabbit, who is a politically connected public opinion leader. It appears that their messages is Beijing is signaling some sort of openness to talks with the United States. So I think on the margins, that is probably a little bit of progress towards, who knows how long that any potential negotiations will actually take place to resolve these trade disputes between the 2 largest countries on Earth. And on the other hand, I think it's also pretty busy here in the United States. I think the Trump administration, since coming to office, their major focus is, in my understanding, a very ambitious domestic agenda. And I think, especially for the Chinese audience, when they are talking about China-U.S. relations, I hope they keep that in mind, that not everything that happens here in the United States is solely focused on China. Even the tariffs imposed on China was at least in the beginning, a part of the broader change in the U.S. trade policy.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think President Trump has been really clear about his focus on a domestic agenda. In some ways, I feel like that mirrors what China has done for many years. My position is that China is very also focused on its domestic agenda, and things like, the overall bilateral trade deficit really come from the Chinese government, particularly the CCP's strategy to improve domestic economies through this, becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. But of course, the spillover effect of managing your domestic economy in that way is to have a trade deficit and perhaps to, from a certain U.S. perspective, make industries around the world uncompetitive by, concentrating them inside China. So it seems to me like both countries are now exporting their domestic political economy problems to the world. How do we unwind? How do we get to a place where either country can accommodate changes in its domestic political economy that would lessen the pain for the rest of the world. Do you think it's possible?
Well, that's also a very huge question. I think from the Chinese side, during the first presidency of Donald Trump, there was this trade war. And ever since then, China has tried to diversify its direct export destinations. So if you look at the US as a share of Chinese export direct destinations, I think the percentage has dropped. And in the meantime, I think Beijing has promoted and implemented what is known as the dual circulation strategy, which basically says, the domestic economic circulation should be the mainstay of the Chinese economy. So, and, I think part of what you said is Beijing openly admitted is that the Chinese economy needs some sort of rebalance. And China recognizes, including in the Central Economic Work Conference, that the lack of the insufficient domestic demand is the number one challenge confronting the Chinese economy. So I think China is moving towards that direction of, because it is the second largest economy in the world. It has, 1.4 billion people. So to rebalance, to have domestic consumption take up a much larger share of its economy, that's something Beijing recognizes. And there is work in progress. However, I think many, both here in the United States as well as in China, believe that the process could be accelerated, especially supported by various sorts of Chinese domestic policy orientations, such as for example, Beijing has been giving out consumer subsidies for laptops, electronics, and home appliances, and they are doubling down on that. There are calls for China to basically bolster its medical insurance, for its social security. So some of the policy suggestions have been put into place. Some of them seem to be increasingly debated, and I think. If you ask Chinese experts on watching the United States, I think they would agree with at least part of what you said. They believe that the United States is externalizing its domestic, challenges or difficulties, because the dollar is the dominant reserve currency, and it seems like the United States, especially American consumers, they spend money quite generously, let's put it this way, and so it has a domestic saving problem. And after I think decades of basically changes in the economic structure, there is a lack of domestic manufacturing here in the United States. I think these concerns to reshore some sort of manufacturing domestically in the U.S., that seems to be the policy choice agreed not just by the Trump administration, but also by the Biden administration. And I don't think China objects to that. And I don't think China has power to object to that. And I think from a national security perspective, as well as employment perspective, a large country, a huge power like the United States, it's natural. They should have some sort of shipbuilding here and to make some of the vital materials at home. And but I think the Chinese grievances, and I think this is also something shared by not just China, but also other trading partners of the United States, is this is not the way to do it. I think under Biden administration, there were Inflation Reduction Act and other, legislations which give more incentives to manufacturing within the United States. But in this administration, it seems like President Trump believes that simply by erecting a wall of tariffs, that will be sufficient enough to incentivize reshoring of manufacturing. I think from the Chinese development experience, many are not convinced. If the U.S. wants to have a significant rebound in its domestic manufacturing, there are a lot of other factors at play. For example, infrastructure, and you need to have in terms of, I think this was also talked about quite hotly in the past few months here because of a book called Abundance, that there needs to be permitting changes, basically making it easier to cut red tapes for building, I don't know, maybe high-speed rail in California. Sure. There needs to be maybe there should be some sort of incentives for people to study STEM more and to have a more robust working force domestically. I think even from the based on what I observe, even from the U.S. national interest perspective, maybe a concerted move to address all these domestic challenges, plus perhaps some sort of tariff incentive, that would seem to be a reasonable path, rather than just slashing tariffs. And these tariffs do not seem to be well planned or precisely executed. They seem to change, at least during a period of time, change by the day, and leading to shocks to the stock market. And on China, because I think although Chinese exports, their direct destination to the U.S. as a percentage of all trade has gone down, but still there is a significant exposure to the U.S. market, not just directly, but also through other trading partners, right. For example, in Vietnam, in other parts of Southeast Asia. So China is concerned that the sudden tariffs, which in the Chinese eyes is totally unprovoked, or at least it hasn't been talked about or negotiated beforehand, that's a shock. And the U.S. seems to be acting in a very condescending way, and that's also something politically I think the Chinese leadership can't take.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that, but I think before we get there, it does seem like if you take a 10,000-foot look at all of this and you say, okay, there is something to be said here, that Chinese do need to rebalance the domestic economy towards more consumption. The U.S. does need to rebalance its domestic economy towards more production, manufacturing. Then it seems like on the surface, these are issues that are well-known, well-studied. There are lots of ways that each country could do it. And what seems to be in the way is, or what seems to be creating greater distrust and mistrust is the methodologies for doing these things or the speed at which they're being done. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the political environment. I was just in China about a month ago, around the time of Liberation Day, and I can say that, two things really stood out to me. One is that due to the incredible pace of kind of change in personnel, but also seemingly change in closeness to Donald Trump among his many staffers, that the Chinese don't exactly know who speaks for Trump on China and trade. If anybody other than the president himself could be an authoritative interlocutor on these points. And then today, we're seeing the reassignment, let's say, of National Security Advisor Waltz, and the reassignment of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which again, as of May 1st, he is now acting NSA as well. The other thing that stuck out to me is that let's take that as a fact, no one speaks for Trump on China and trade except Trump itself. Then how does China actually deal with Trump? Because what I heard in China and from the Chinese perspective is that it would be an incredible political risk inside China to put Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in a room or maybe even on a phone call together, given President Trump's kind of off-the-cuff remarks and treatment of other world leaders, the whole atmosphere that's been created by some of the comments that were made around, countries needing to come to us over us being the U.S. over the tariffs. How is that all looking from your perspective as someone who observes U.S.-China relations so closely? Are the moves that China has made in the last couple of days that might be kind of table setting for negotiations? Do you think China is looking for reciprocity on the U.S. side in terms of that easing of tensions? And what would be credible at this point, given all of the other dynamics I've just described?
Well, first of all, it's very good to hear your takeaway from a recent visit to China. I would sincerely hope, like, think tank scholars and especially senior leaders like you to visit China more often, to get to hear what the people think and on the grounds of Beijing, Shanghai, but maybe also other places. And I think in this term, actually both sides started pretty well since the election of President Trump, re-election of President Trump in November 2024. It started feel like, I guess, and I think the then President-elect Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping had a phone call on January 17th. Correct. Before President Trump actually came to office. By then, he was saying, pretty nice and very sensible things on China. And he was saying, the Chinese leader was his good friend. They had a very good relationship. But on the other hand, he felt like, China was taking advantage of the United States, as every other country on earth, including the European Union. So that's not un-Euro by President Trump's standards. And at that time, I also observed, for example, senior U.S. officials, or by then, many of them have not been confirmed by the Senate, including perhaps Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others, who used to be considered very hawkish on China. When they were, after they were nominated, I think their comments on China feels like, very mature, very professional statesmen. And for example, I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio was saying that basically we don't like what China has been doing, but China is here to stay. They are not going anywhere, and we also wish them great success. We wish for China to be doing well because it has such a huge country and stuff like that. I think. Yeah, that was quite a good start. And also, unprecedentedly, I think President Trump extended an invitation to the Chinese leadership to come to Washington, D.C. to take part of his inauguration ceremony. And China did send one of its senior-most officials, the Vice President of the People's Republic of China, to come to the Washington, D.C. And but I think the tensions really escalated after Liberation Day. I think before Liberation Day, President Trump imposed some of the tariffs on China, citing fentanyl, and but Chinese response at that time was, I think, by all accounts, quite measured. And I think at the time, the headlines across, I guess, Financial Times and all the major mainstream newspapers was still like the Chinese response was measured. And but at the same time, I think for like well-known and very good scholars like you and maybe others in Asia Society Policy Institute, I guess if Trump administration officials have asked you, you would have told them that if you did this, if you impose like 40% more, 80% more, don't expect Beijing to send its officials to come to Washington, D.C. to drop their knees and beg for some sort of reprieve. That's not going to happen. I think when China was retaliating in a reserved way before the so-called Liberation Day, the signal was also like Beijing is going to stand firm on this, and there is going to be tit-on-tat. And based on public reports, I think senior Trump administration officials, it seems that they were under the, misinformed judgment that they were expecting China to basically kneel down. Maybe that's too strong a term, sure. But to compromise, to seek some sort of relief by begging the Trump administration. I think that has proved to be a wrong judgment. And also, I think for people who study the Chinese politics, its diplomacy, and especially its history, it was plain as day that there was no way that Beijing was gonna do that. And so actually, the Beijing's retaliations were totally expected. I think at this moment, nobody knows what's going to happen, but I think the Chinese Ministry of Commerce have said that one of the preconditions for the any serious trade negotiations would be some sort of cancellation or suspension of the extra tariffs imposed on the Chinese goods. And at the same time, in the past few weeks, we have seen some exemptions here in the United States on, for example, iPhones, and also in China as well, on China's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports. For example, I think it was reported that some of the some materials related to semiconductors and also parts of making airplanes that Beijing has exempt them from this retaliatory tariffs. I think some scholar did an estimation that some of the exemptions is actually quite substantial. It's like 27% on the U.S. part. And I think I would hope that the skilled diplomats on both sides could find some way to get to the negotiating table to really engage in some serious and in-depth talks. But one of the main challenges, exactly as you said, is I think that this is not something that Beijing faces, but also even for domestic like people here in the United States, they would find that the chaos within the administration is just too overwhelming. Like if people here who live here, who study here, who used to work in the government can't figure out, who to talk to, who is, the best interlocutor to negotiate with President Trump, then it's going to be very difficult for China, which doesn't have a lot of trust to begin with. And I think Ryan Haas has a very good expression. According to him, President Trump is his own desk officer in terms of China.
Well, Ryan is brilliant. So, of course, he has the exact right way to describe this. A desk officer, of course, being someone at the State Department who follows and coordinates all of the policy activity of the U.S. government. It does seem like we're in a place now where, on the one hand, we have kind of like the styles of leadership and negotiation, which I actually think the Trump administration more closely approximates the Xi Jinping administration than many other American administrations ever have. I like to think of both Donald Trump and Xi Jinping as people who have 3 no's: no friends, no enemies, and no apologies. So like very pragmatic in some ways with who they want to work with in the world and how they want to work. But on the other hand, this like kind of personal loyalty, personal brand, personal reputation, not only carries weight for them, but really is reflective for them on the rest of the country and how it's perceived. So very important for both of them to like have that face, and the question is simply, how will those leadership styles, which can be a little contradictory in and of themselves, now interact with the real economy, right? Which is a source of legitimacy for both governments, is being able to manage the real economy well. But unfortunately, as you mentioned, the way that all of this is rolling out, and I think this is not new in U.S.-China relations, but the way that U.S.-China relations have evolved over the past 15 or so years, has really created this intense atmosphere of distrust and mistrust. Both sides seem to have had expectations of the other that did not pan out, and they've reevaluated their assessment of the other's trustworthiness so many times now and in so many ways that I think it's spilled over to a large extent on people-to-people exchange, on dialogue, on communication between the two sides. Again, you're a person who, writes in English about what's happening in China. You're currently a graduate student at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. How do you see this changing political environment affecting people-to-people ties and your own experience as a Chinese student in the United States?
So thank you for bringing it up. I'm actually doing a mid-career Master in Public Policy MPP degree in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Mm-hmm. If I can give a shout out to SPEAR. It's a very good mid-career program with like a very small class of 24 people. And, for many, aspiring students, this mid-career program is miraculously fully funded, which means Princeton and SPEAR generously gives exempts all the tuition and the healthcare insurance coverage, and also gives a generous living stipend. So if you are like contemplating about going to get a mid-career public policy degree, think about SPEAR, think about MPP.
And you get to live in Princeton, which is a very nice place.
Yes, and so coming back, I think I think the Chinese have acutely understood that the reduced number of people traveling between the two countries, especially among the younger generation, that's going to be very challenging in the long run. So I think part of the reason came from not just bilateral dynamics, but also COVID. And during COVID, China imposed draconian controls at the border, and you have to go through lengthy days of quarantine, which actually deterred a lot of international travel in and out of China. And I think there was some statistics showing that I guess there were just hundreds of American students in China. So I think in November 2023, when President Xi Jinping was visiting San Francisco, and he gave a speech, which I think actually Asia Society, alongside the Council on Foreign Relations and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, were the organizations that hosted
National
him.
Committee as well.
Yeah, National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and the USCBC. And he announced a invitation to have like 50,000 U.S. students visit China in 5 years. I think that was that's a very good initiative still going on. And I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced maybe according to their statistics, 15,000 or 16,000 American students were in China. I'm pretty sure that's not on a long-term basis, but also including short-term visits.
Yeah, my understanding is that there have been a number of exchange programs, particularly among even younger folks, like middle school, high school, to bring them over to China for short-term stays. But from my perspective, all contact is, useful contact. People need to go places and see things. But yeah, 50,000 students, it would be a pretty ambitious goal right now.
And the other way around, I think the Chinese students, well, at least until I guess very recently, they are still very interested in studying in the United States. I think the number was there was something like 300,000 Chinese students in the United States, or maybe over 290,000. And of course, I think the largest cohort of nationality is actually Indian students inside the United States. I think many Chinese students, as well as their parents, still see the United States as a place to go, and that's also the choice I made. I had several admission offers from, let's say, some of the leading universities in Asia and Britain, but I chose to come here to study at Princeton, and because I think this is the place. Well, first and foremost, I think the United States is still the only superpower in the world, and so at least when it comes to public policy, this is a place to be. And also, the U.S. has the best in world. Scientific research, technology development. You have great startups in Silicon Valley and also in other parts of the United States. This is still a significant attraction to Chinese students. And but recently, I guess, situation really changed a little bit, especially with the cancellation of student visas. I think so far it's a bit clear that the Trump administration is not targeting Chinese students. I think most of the visa cancellations concentrated on campus protests related to Gaza, and there was some other, I saw a report of a Japanese student whose visa was revoked because of some speeding tickets and a fishing citation, and he's at Birmingham Young University, but fortunately his visa has been reinstated after press reports. So that does create I think a bad effect on many international students. And with bilateral tensions between China and the US this high, that may be, that would create extra concerns for Chinese students and for Chinese students, for their parents. And but in the long run, I think as we both know, and as people in the scholarly and in the academics, in the think tank arena know, this is something to be seriously taken care of. We need to have like bilateral exchanges, whether long-term degree-seeking students, or maybe just short-term visits by institutions like Asia Society Policy Institute, or maybe Track 2, Track 1.5 dialogues, because these are two most consequential countries on earth, and it's just too important to have their links totally cut off. And I think like most Republicans, and including President Trump, also doesn't mind these sort of exchanges, although there are some noises from some of the members of Congress who have proposed bills that they would want to revoke all visas for Chinese students. I'm pretty sure that's not going to be U.S. law anytime soon, but I think that is not helpful. And also, I think it's better to have like more Chinese students here, not just for China, but for the United States as well. I think Jensen Huang of NVIDIA said yesterday somewhere that he said like 50% of AI talents have some sort of Chinese heritage. So like the US becoming as a destination of international talent, the US actually benefits from that as well. And even for Chinese students and other countries' students, even if they don't stay here and when they go back, that actually creates a bridge to mitigate any potential miscalculations between across the Pacific Ocean. And but unfortunately, we are indeed seeing fewer and fewer people, including in the think tank in I think Track 2, and not to mention official dialogues. I don't think we have any evidence of seeing official talks on trade and.
Yeah, I mean, certainly over the last few years, there's been an increasing perception, at least in the United States, that travel to China is not as safe as it used to be. That's the challenge, I think, on both sides is that, on the one hand, there are legitimate national security concerns that need to be addressed, including concerns about people-to-people exchange. On the other hand, you're often dealing with environments where evidence is not available. You have to prejudge people before they come to the country, right? So, and also, there's a kind of a gray area sense of what is appropriate inside each country at this point, whether, that's not related to China perhaps, but like student protests is certainly something that's been a tradition in the United States for a very long time, is now being treated very differently than it was in the past. In China, various strains of research, questions, people you can meet with feel more curtailed than they used to. So I think it is incredibly important.
I do think, I think many of the audience know that, for example, China opened visa-free travels to basically, I think, almost all EU member states now, and also to Australia and New Zealand, which are members of the so-called Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. And when I and I think a dozen Princeton Spear students led by a professor went to the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., like the official at the Chinese embassy in D.C. told us, like I guess 20 people in the room, that like the potential option of giving visa-free travels to Americans are certainly on the table. So if that can be implemented, I think that would certainly help, right? And to make it much easier logistically to travel to China. And that's, I think, if like the two countries can find the right table to sit down at and come to some sort of understanding, there are a lot of things that could happen. And not just in terms of visa-free travel for U.S. citizens potentially to travel to China, but also I think President Trump actually mentioned it quite often, I think, including in his first cabinet meeting, which was broadcast on U.S. television, that he welcomes Chinese investment. I think on that point, I guess he stands like outside the mainstream U.S. politicians and the think tank community, I guess. But I think he is actually not very ideological when it comes to China. He believes like Chinese companies to come here and they can help reindustrialize the United States. And I think there are quite many Chinese companies which are interested in doing that as well. There is Goshen Battery, which is a battery maker, a leading one, which I think set up shop somewhere in the United States. I think there is also, CATL, the biggest battery maker, which has entered into some sort of licensing agreement with Ford. But if they could really expect some sort of stable and predictable political and especially hospitable political environment, I think the Chinese companies wouldn't mind come here, because this is like one of their major markets, and they want to be able to get closer to their market, and also to take advantage of the talent here, of the research here, and there can be a lot of good things coming out of some sort of collaborations. I'm pretty sure, like many people here would say, like there should be some sort of national security carve-outs. For example, you can make your battery here, but probably not telecommunications devices that will be used by AT&T. And but I think once they really sit down, these are the things. At least I think on the Chinese side, that's something that can totally be talked about.
Yeah, agreed. I think we had a good conversation here about kind of the opportunity cost of strategic mistrust. I want to pivot a little bit to some things that are very specific to you personally. You're the founder and editor of both The East is Red, READ for those listening, and Pekingology's Substacks. You were pretty, I think, early subscriber and writer on Substack specifically. And you've developed a really good kind of credibility among the various China watching communities, both here and around the world. How do you navigate writing about sensitive issues with followings in both the West and in China? What are some of the challenges that you've faced kind of maintaining resources for China watchers in the current political environment?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about what I do. So for listeners who are not very familiar with me, basically I grew up in China, went to a Chinese college, after which I joined Xinhua News Agency, the China State News Agency, right away. I started at 2 provincial local bureaus for 6.5 years. So initially I had nothing to do with China-US relations or whatnot. But then I was posted to European Union to become a EU correspondent for 2.5 years. And it was in Brussels when I started to go on Twitter and started Pekingology, the Substack. Well, I should say I was first inspired by Bill Bishop, and his cynicism is an industry icon, and he does a spectacular job of, whether you believe or you agree with him, like on some of his personal commentaries, he does a very good job of rounding up, what happened. This is like the latest China news of yesterday, and that's something really good and very useful actually. But what I observed in May 2020 was that there were already quite some China Substacks, so newsletters delivered by email to subscribers, but none of them came from a Chinese mainland institution or individual, much less someone who was working within China's state apparatus. So I thought I could fill the void. And at the time, I was thinking maybe, in the midterm or in the mid to long term, I could make some money off it. So that's how I started. And to be very honest, I just started without, asking for any sort of approval. And, in English, there is this proverb which says it's better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. I think that also applies in the Chinese context. So what I do mostly is, I think, when I try to describe what I do, I rarely use the word write, because what I do is mostly I locate, translate, summarize, contextualize, annotate Chinese public discussions about China's public policies that are already available in Chinese on some Chinese websites. For example, the blogs of, for example, the National School of Development at Peking University. They have a lot of events, and their professors or leading economists or sociologists, they talk about something really at length and in depth. What I do is, after seeking their permission, I turn them into English and then I put it out. So I'm very fortunate that by now I have over 20,000 subscribers, which I'm really fortunate to have their trust in interested in reading what I publish over there. And the other newsletter you talked about is called The East is Red. That started when I left Xinhua in 2022 and joined the Center for China and Globalization, which is leading non-governmental think tank in China. So The East is Red didn't start from scratch. So before I went to CCG already had its own newsletter because the non-governmental think tank has been operating for quite a few years. So they have a large newsletter email base. So I took advantage of that and developed the East is Red, which is to be a pawn. And there is this sound in China's, cultural revolution, the East is red, but also, you can read the East here. And initially I wanted to make it very policy specific, but basically I failed. And so the East is Red now has 11,000 subscribers. It's similar to technology. So it's also about basically making Chinese discussions about Chinese policies available in English. And I'm fortunate to have a full-time colleague, Miss Jia Yuxuan, who helps me full-time. And we also have several interns. And actually, the leaders of CCG, Henry, Wang Huiyao, and Miao Lu, they rarely intervene in the daily operations of what technology and the East is Red, and also another one, CCG Update, to publish. And so far, I think what I try to do is, there are still some very substantial discussions about China and China's foreign policies, including China-U.S. relations, taking place. And I do think I'd like to believe I'm trying to make a contribution to enrich the discourse, the international English language discourse on China. And I'm citing, I guess, Yao Yang, Justin Yifuling, and these are all people well educated. Many of them have Western experience, and I think their understanding of these issues are valuable as well. And what I'm most proud of is, since I started that, there is also, Jiang Jiang's Ginger River Review and Yang Liu's Beijing channel, and they were my former colleagues at the State News Agency.
Right.
And I'm very glad to have more China Substacks coming out. And to my knowledge, they just operate on their own. And but that's far from enough. That's just not sufficient enough. There needs to be much more knowledge sharing and trying to understand each other's viewpoints and approaching them from from empathy, and also from not coming and try to read the stuff with some original hostility towards, because when you see something coming out of China, that must be CCP propaganda. And I'm sorry to say, a lot of times that's the mindset. In the West, and it works the other way around. The Chinese will say, the New York Times, they're trying to smear China, and and the Western mainstream media, they are just tools of the U.S. government or other Western governments. And I think it would be best to approach this sort of information with humility and with basically with a spirit of trying to have more understanding.
Yeah, I totally agree. I remember actually, I think the first time we met in person, November 2023, I came to China, to Beijing, just before the Xi-Biden meeting at APEC in San Francisco.
With some of your colleagues.
With some of my colleagues, and you brought some of your colleagues. And I remember that trip very well. It was almost a year after COVID restrictions had ended. But the sense in the United States was that China was in a long-term slump, that COVID recovery had made people quite pessimistic, that the way that the controls were lifted had damaged trust between government and society. And I went there kind of expecting to hear more of that. And I did actually hear quite a bit more of that. And then I met with you and your colleagues, and you were so optimistic about the future of China as a market, as a place where ideas could be exchanged, as as an area of growth for journalism and analysis. How do you think that feels now? It's been a year and a half. Events have moved on. What's your sense of what the younger generation in China sees as the current trajectory of U.S.-China relations, and how does this new media kind of factor into people's optimism or pessimism about what's to come?
Well, I think from what I've observed here in the United States, during that period of time, China was peaking, or at least China was platooing. That was dominating the discussion. But as of now, maybe 1.5 years later, we have Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi in the Foreign Affairs, and on the Foreign Affairs interview, which they are saying after government surveys that Americans must not underestimate China. So there was a little bit of change on that, and I think part of that is driven by domestic politics here in the United States. And also, I think on the Chinese part, you have a great question, but I don't think I have a very good answer on that, partly because there is no objective polling data that we can refer to. I think the Carter Center just published a poll. I think they are discussing it right now in Princeton Spear DC Center as we speak. And that poll shows overall, the Chinese, so they were polling the Chinese on their attitude towards the U.S. And overall, they have a unfavorable attitude towards the United States as a nation. But at the same time, an overwhelming majority, I think something like 70% of the Chinese believe that it's crucial to maintain commercial economic collaboration with the United States. So I think this sort of uncomfortable coexistence is going to be there for a long time. I think for the younger generation in China, well, I'm 36. I don't know if I'm one of the younger generation, maybe not. I think they have they speak better English. They have more opportunities to travel abroad, to study abroad, including the United States. So perhaps, to quote the words from the Chinese president, he believes the younger and the more contemporary Chinese are now more able to look at the world eye to eye rather than look up to them or look down on them. So I think overall that would be something that's a healthy development. I do think. I think if you ask the traditional Chinese liberals, they sometimes have a unrealistically romantic impression of the United States, where it used to be said, for example, the Constitution of the United States, one of the oldest in the world, is such a magic, spectacular piece of paper, a lot of wisdom in it. But if you study here in the policy schools, professors keep telling you that it has its own structural problems, and that is one of the fundamental reasons why there are so many challenges in the U.S. political system. So I think people are seeing the U.S. from a more comprehensive point of view, and of course their sense of the United States, of their sense of China's standing in the world, is also conditioned upon maybe better income and better opportunities for them. So I guess they would be more confident. But at the same time, I think at the end of the day, not just here in the United States, but also in China, that inequality is going to be a huge part of the discussion. Actually, as we speak, I think the number one news at this moment within China is a story about equality, not U.S.-China relations, because people are talking about, whether let's say some doctors at a top Chinese hospital, part of a top Chinese medical school, if access to them are actually equal. So I think I would hope the younger generation, maybe as AOC, pay more attention to, whether people actually have affordable housing, whether their healthcare needs are being met, whether after retirement they could have a better life. So I think it's always coming back to the very thing you mentioned at the beginning. It's always the domestic matters that matter most. Xi Jinping always says, it's better to the most important thing for the Communist Party of China is always to manage China's own affairs well. I think education, housing, healthcare, these are the things that matter most. And it is always these things that fundamentally determine the trajectory of any country on a long-term basis. And I think on the long term, for example, when it comes to US-China relations, I'm actually optimistic. I think, first of all, there will be some sort of rebalance in people's understanding and in people's appreciation of one another. I think like China will, in the long run, be recognized here in the U.S. as a force to reckon with. Yeah. And it's not a cheap country, a factory floor just churning out cheap toys and stuff. But actually, more importantly, is I sincerely believe the Chinese do not have an agenda to kick the U.S. off the world stage and become the second and only hegemon of the world. And I know many people here in the United States categorically do not believe that. I sincerely believe that. I think it's not in the Chinese culture or history genes, or the Chinese don't have this ambition to become the next king of the world. And they also understand it from their recent history that because China was bullied by imperial powers from the West for a long time, and there was this Japanese aggression in China during the Second World War. And I think the Chinese want a peaceful, prosperous future, a coexistence with the United States and the rest of the world. But in that process, alongside China's rise, there were some natural extensions of that rise. It's you will see more Chinese ships across the world. You will see more Chinese investment in Africa. And from a U.S. perspective, which is used to dominate the world, this is something, I guess, it will take time to adjust to. I think most of these activities are not inherently threatening, at least from the Chinese perspective. It's we're doing business with the Middle East, with Africa, but for a country that has been prosperous, successful, and influential for so long, to suddenly have a near competitor, that feels uncomfortable, and I get that.
Yeah, I think the argument has increased in sophistication from there's 100-year plans to take over the world to saying China's interest will drive it towards global leadership, whether it likes it or not. And the U.S. interest would be best served if that leadership were based on a rules-based system, or at least let's say that was the case up until a few months ago. And I really appreciate your kind of attention toward, reminding everyone that we shouldn't idealize either political system as inherently delivering a specific type of performance. In reality, people are looking for a performance that improves their day-to-day lives. And there are lots of different types of political systems that could deliver that, and there is no inherent right choice to, a straight line between a constitution or a founding document and delivering that performance, but it's all about how we handle ourselves and how we behave in the world. So I'm really glad we were able to unpack some of these issues today. Thank you so much for being here today, and I think these are exactly the types of conversations we need to have in order to ensure that we can at least come to an uncomfortable coexistence, which is going to be my new watchword. Forget peaceful. I think it's going to be categorized by that discomfort, but we need to manage.
Well, thank you for having me here. I mean, what an institution you have here at Asia Society. I think under your former head, His Excellency Kevin Rudd, and also under your current President Kang, and Asia Society has grown its capabilities and capacities and interactions with Asia, and particularly with China, significantly. You were part of one of the 5 organizations which hosted the Chinese president in November 2023. I think you and your colleagues with capable senior managers like you, like Jing Qian, there is, I think, track 2 or track 1.5 dialogues with the Chinese authorities, you are really making a big difference, and this is very crucial work. So, and I guess I'm the first Chinese mainland guest to appear on Asia Inside Out since its relaunch in 2023, so that will be an extra personal honor. Thank you for the invitation, and it's really a great pleasure to be here.
Of course, anytime.